Welcome to Unmasking Government Schools with Sherry Few, USPIE's weekly podcast that empowers parents to reclaim their children's education from government bureaucrats and social engineers. In each episode, Sherry delivers the latest news from the front lines of the fight for the minds of the next generation, equipping you with the tools and resources needed to join the cause.
Hi everyone, welcome to Unmasking Government Schools with Sherry Few. I'm your host, Sherry Few, and I have another great show for you today. Joining me again is fellow board member Melanie Kurdys, also the president of USPIE's chapter in Michigan. But before I bring her on, please give us a 5-star rating and subscribe to the show. And be sure to visit uspie.org to learn more and join the movement.
Today's episode is brought to you by U.S. parents involved in education. USPIE's mission is to empower parents and local communities to break free from federal and national influences, thereby reclaiming parental authority over their children's education. For more insights from U.S. parents involved in education, connect with us at USPIE on X and Facebook. To join the movement, visit uspie.org.
Welcome back to Unmasking Government Schools with Sherry Few. My guest today is Melanie Kurdys. Melanie is an accomplished businesswoman, researcher, education activist, and a mother of 3 adult children and grandmother to 8. She has worked for IBM, AT&T, and Arthur Young, among others, and was also an active school volunteer and in-school math tutor in Louisiana, California, Georgia, and Michigan. Melanie's drafted USPIE's blueprint to close the U.S. Department of Education, as well as our blueprint to establish state control of education, both of which we will be discussing today. Melanie Kurdys, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you, Sherry. It's an honor to be back.
Okay, we have a lot to cover today, so I'd like to discuss President Trump's executive order to close the Department of Education and some of the points in our 2 blueprints, as well as our work with various members of Congress regarding legislation to actually close the department outright. Let's start with Trump's executive order. How do you see it, Melanie?
Well, I was reading through the actual details of the order, and it's very promising. I mean, President Trump refers to many of the concerns that we did, that it's an unaccountable bureaucracy that's grown and completely failed to help our teachers and families. And the fact of the matter is the Department of Education doesn't educate anyone. All it does is handle money and regulation. So it's very heartening to see that he understands that. He has an interesting line. He says, closing the Department of Education would provide children and their families the opportunity to escape a system that is failing them. And that really is at the heart of what we're trying to accomplish as well. Getting the federal government out of the way, reducing the state impact, and freeing up parents and local communities to be in control of education. So I'm quite excited about his goals. The concerns I have are in the actual implementation, which we'll have to see what's actually going to happen, because he talks about it generically. But like one of the ideas is the student loan grants for universities, and he says that the Department of Education is not a bank. So we totally agree. So my understanding is just recently, within last week, he moved the loan program to the Small Business Administration. Well, the fact is the Small Business Administration isn't a bank either. So really I'm hoping this is a temporary move, and that the goal is to actually try to move these out of the government to private loan institutions, which would be great, because then they would use better practices for making those loans. Another one that they've just announced is that they're moving students with disabilities and the nutrition program to Health and Human Services. I'm assuming this is the IDEA program. That is a little bit more problematic because our position is that we've looked at the IDEA, and we really believe the states are in a much better position to administer this program and to regulate. We have one of our PIE presidents who was a child psychologist when IDEA was passed, and she was just lamenting to me how frustrating it is that over these years, the paperwork about writing up what students, their status is and what you need to do. It's gone from a front and back one-page document to almost a booklet. And so the energy is expended on documentation and then obviously taking the energy away from actually helping the children. And again, that's all the federal government can do. They're not really leveraging good ideas for states to use for students with special needs. It's quite a hole in the system. A lot of parents will tell you these programs are not working well. Their biggest concern is losing funding. And that's why some our ideas are moving funding, but eliminating the federal regulation that's getting in the way.
So, you pointed out some things I observed in the executive order too. When you mentioned his goals, um, I almost felt like some of this language came right out of our blueprint, where they say the experiment of controlling American education through federal programs and dollars, on and on. But I think we said something very similar to that in our blueprint. So maybe they received our blueprint and thought it was a good idea. But I loved that they admitted that it's failing children. It hasn't worked. And so this idea of just transferring the money into other agencies so that they can implement the programs, that doesn't really fix the problem of the federal intrusion in education, which
Right.
is what our organization, of course, believes is that the federal government has no business in education, and we have to return all of the authority and the funding back to the states. So, yes, I agree. It's problematic that we're hearing so much talk about shifting the funding just into other agencies.
Well,
So I agree with you too.
move away from the executive order and talk about how we might help make some of these things happen correctly. There was one other thing from the order that I thought was worth noting, and that was there's an emphasis that says the Department of Education funds are subject to rigorous compliance with federal law and requiring that any program receiving federal assistance terminate illegal discrimination under the label diversity, equity, and inclusion, or similar terms and programs promoting gender ideology. And the concern with this one is it demonstrates that President Trump is still willing to use the money from the federal government to define policy within the states. And that is problematic. I mean, some number of us might like President Trump's preferences on policy, but if we're actually going to improve education, this flip-flopping of educational philosophy and the pressure with the federal funds is really not the way to manage it. And so it would be our hope that in the end, he will move programs like this to the Justice Department and the Civil Rights Division and address it from a legality point of view and stop using the federal dollars as a bludgeon because the next administration could do it another way.
Well, I totally agree with you about that. And I've actually had some conversations recently, on that topic. And so while we obviously believe that we have to pull the federal government's involvement out by the roots, just eliminate it altogether, I'm wondering if maybe just initially for this initial phase of his presidency, it would be advantageous for him to use the funding that way. We've seen, of course, several universities that have been pressured and even caved. Columbia University, for one, on their outrageous anti-Semitic policies in their university. So I'm hopeful that President Trump sees it our way, understanding that the next administration just can reverse everything with another executive order and use the money as a hammer to push their ideology as they've done in the past. But until we're able to affect Congress to make some of the changes that are necessary legally and close the Department of Education, remove the federal laws that influence state education, do you think it's possible that it could be used for a good sense just temporarily?
Well, we do recognize that some force is needed because even states that have passed their own laws, there are teachers and administrators that are working around them to institute the policies they want to anyway. And so I think if it's a temporary with a goal of moving away from that by the end of his term, be great. And we just need to get clarity with Congress and what their strategy is, especially since they're going to be doing more discrete budgeting and less of the continuing resolution. They can handle some of these things in their budgeting and appropriations process. Yes, I think that in the interim time, it can put pressure on the schools that are accepting government funds to rethink some of these policies that they're taking in a serious way. So, yeah, that would be good.
Yeah. So one other thing before we do move on from the executive order, you had talked about the student loan program. And of course, the debt portfolio in the executive order is enumerated as $1.6 trillion. So I couldn't recall, but it seemed like you and I had a conversation about this. Can you remind me? We believe, of course, that the loans need to go through banks, and it essentially the executive order says that, as you pointed out, the Department of Ed's not a bank. So if we were to quit issuing loans through the government to students, and banks picked up that responsibility, rightly so, what would we do with the debt portfolio? Where should it go?
Well, I'm not really a finance person, so I can't imagine. I suppose, whether you can sell debt, right? If some bank wanted to take the benefits, or a couple banks take the benefits of continuing a student loan program that has some level of government guarantee support to it. But and in the process of getting that opportunity, they buy the debt. I don't know. I'd have to think about that a little bit more. But I think the problem is that by having the government provide unlimited funds to college students, universities have taken advantage of that and increased their tuition rates to unreasonable levels. And they're getting other money as well from the federal government. So you've got a system that is very poorly managed in terms of their finances, and they build huge endowments and don't use that toward student scholarships and keeping tuition low in general. So, the temporary situation of reducing the number of new loans should help put pressure on the universities. If you want to keep getting students, you're going to have to figure out how to get your tuition back in line with reality.
That's a very good point. I didn't mean to put you on the spot there,
All
but
right.
I was thinking about that earlier, and couldn't recall if we had discussed it or not. But it's something certainly to think about. So let's talk specifically about our blueprint. And you were the chief architect of this fabulous document. Of course, we published it first in 2017. You and I and other members of our leadership team traveled to Washington, D.C. We met with some congressmen, some staffers. We met with think tanks, and we shared our blueprint. At that time, I think it was just sort of a blimp on the screen for people, and they were pleased to welcome us and hear what we had to say. But now that it's becoming a reality, I think we have people's attention. And of course, we came back from Washington, D.C. based on the input we received and made a few updates in 2018. And then just in December of 2024, just a few months ago, we updated it again because we wanted to get it in the hands of those who are making decisions about closing the Department of Ed. And as you know, we sent over 800 copies of the blueprint throughout the country to every congressman, to the president, to his chief of staff, secretary of education, Elon Musk, think tanks. We wanted to be sure that everybody had a copy of this very thoughtful design for how this can be done properly. And I thank you, Melanie, for your work on this. You're a valuable asset to USPIE, and you have such great insight about policy. So let's start first. And of course, we have two blueprints. Let me just kind of frame that as well. So a couple of years ago, when we were under the Biden administration and the left had control of Congress, we understood that we were spinning our wheels thinking that we were going to get anything done on the federal level as far as closing the Department of Education. But states were becoming ever more frustrated with the demands from the federal government and the threats to withhold federal funding if they didn't comply with some of their woke agenda that they were trying to force through the federal funding. So that's when you had the brilliant idea to create the blueprint to establish state control of education, which would empower states to wean themselves off the federal dole so they would no longer have to cower to their mandates. So that's just kind of an outline for our viewers of the two blueprints. But let's start with the first blueprint to close the U.S. Department of Education. And I'd love to just turn it over to you to explain a little bit about that to our viewers.
Well, thank you, Sherry. Yeah, we put this model out, and interestingly, like you said, the flow of it follows a lot like the executive order in that it articulates with evidence the failure of the federal Department of Education in their ability to actually influence positively the outcome of student learning, which is the purpose of education. So we came up with this this explanation, and it's really very easy. It's 5 steps that we describe. I mean, they're not simple things to do, but in concept, they're fairly easy to understand. So the first idea was to send all program management and the funds to the states. So you are returning control, and then to repeal the laws to get the federal government out of education altogether. So these 2 steps would get the federal government out of managing the money and out of the regulation and out of the laws that are demanding those things. We did suggest privatizing college loans, eliminating all offices within the Department of Education and the related spending. And then the final goal is to reduce the tax collection by the federal government so that the money doesn't go to the federal government ever, that the states have a strategy to withhold those funds within their state through the standard process of, like income tax, federal income tax, where that's the primary way the federal government gets money from us, the citizens. So it articulates 5 very carefully considered steps in sequence to allow it to happen. Our biggest concern about moving programs to other departments is it's harder to track them. So we use the Department of Education budgeting information to help us see how much money the federal government is spending in education. But right now, Health and Human Services administers Head Start, which is an education program that we include in our blueprint that we think should be returned. Early childhood should be returned to the states completely. And the free and reduced lunch, which is administered by the Agriculture Department, which is another program we think should be returned to the states because the complaints about the quality of food and the expense and the overhead have been pretty significant. And we do include in the blueprint some examples of schools and school districts that have actually done that. And in net, they spend less money. They have better food quality that the children like better. And so they have a lot less garbage, a lot less food that is wasted and thrown away. So we just really believe that returning all these programs back to the states in their entirety is the way you will empower. And I loved where when you interviewed Carol Swain recently, she said, some states will do it better than other states. And that is absolutely true. But that's the whole point. Within a state, the citizens have a lot more influence on their state government. And they can say, hey, state over there, look at what they're doing. Their kids are eating better food. They're learning how to read. Why can't we do what they're doing? And you can create momentum within your state to implement better policy, which is really difficult for us to influence what happens at the federal level.
Yes, those are all very good points. I appreciate you explaining the 5 simple steps. That's one thing I love about our 2 blueprints is they're very down to earth, very easy to understand. A layperson can understand it. It's not full of a lot of technical jargon, legalese that people can understand. It's very straightforward. It's common sense. And so, a couple of the points you made, I'd like to follow up on because I, when I do interviews, I talk a lot about the idea of retaining the funding within the state or shifting the tax collection method so that states retain the funding within their state. And that's a common sense thing. I think most people can understand how much money is wasted when you take it from the taxpayers and send it to the federal government, siphon off the majority of it to fund the bureaucracy that it takes for the federal government to implement these programs, and then send pennies back with regulations and mandates attached. So that's such an important step for people to understand, particularly those who are making decisions about closing the Department of Ed. Just shifting the funds to other federal agencies is not going to solve the problem of the federal intrusion, nor is it cost effective or efficient to handle it that way. So I appreciate you emphasizing those points. So now I'd just like to talk briefly about the other blueprint, and then we're going to get into some of the things that we're doing to try to influence Congress to change the laws that are necessary to be changed to make this happen. So, you want to talk a little bit about the state blueprint?
Sure. So I kind of wish we had come up with the idea for the state blueprint a few years earlier, because had even 1 or 2 states demonstrated that they can educate their kids without the federal government being involved, this whole actual transition of closing the federal Department of Education wouldn't have seemed so monumental to a lot of people. But again, in the investigation, we discovered that on average, 10% of school funding comes from the federal government. So in our blueprint to close the eliminate your federal involvement in education in your state, the first step is to do an analysis of how much money you actually get from the federal government. And although 10% of a big budget is a big dollar figure, it's only 10%. And so when you put it in those terms, you help people understand we're not talking about the majority of your money. And then the next step is to do what we call a cost of compliance. And this cost of compliance it guides a state through a study to look at the money they get from the federal government and look at the rules and regulations and red tape imposed on that money. So in reporting and limiting what decisions you can make about the programs in your state, and you quantify that. And so it will be less than 10%. And, in a funny conversation we had with Neil McCluskey at Cato when we were in DC the first time around, we were joking about, could it be as high as 50% of that money is wasted on red tape? And I mean, we don't know. We have to do some of these cost of compliance studies, but even if it's only 20%, which I don't think anybody thinks 20% is an exaggeration, you're now talking about significantly less of the money actually being useful to your programming. And then when you look at programs like Head Start, specifically these childhood programs, I think every state has its own early childhood program because Head Start doesn't cover all students. And so you're trying to run 2 programs. So you have the bureaucracy of trying to figure out which kids qualify for which ones, which teachers are certified for which ones. Can you put them in the same building? It's really difficult if you put them in the same building. So now in a community, if you run a Head Start program, but you don't really have enough kids to justify it, or you run Head Start and that's the primary one, but you don't have enough kids to run your state program, it just adds so much complexity. And it adds an inefficiency. And again, the energy is not focused on actually helping children learn and be prepared, have fun, engage in the social community, the things that we really want from preschool participation. So that's just one little example. So we do the figure out how much comes from the feds, do the cost of compliance, and then you can build political will. And program by program, you take, for example, Head Start, IDEA, Title I, each of these programs one at a time, and you look at what do we already do in our state and how could we run that program without the federal overhead and oversight. And so in our model, we actually were saying that you would get none of that money, that your goal was to end up with none of that money. And right now, with the model of closing the Department of Education, we think it would be reasonable for states to get some of that money. Again, if you can turn it all around so that the state can keep the money in the first place, that's the next step, is that once you realize that your state can run these programs, you figure out a tax structure where you can keep that money within your state and it doesn't go to the federal government. One of the typical ways was like the state and local tax program, which back in Trump's first term, they did away with the deduction for they called it the SALT deduction. But you could make a negotiation with the federal government to say education dollars, the offset education dollars ought to be a legitimate tax deduction for your state so that you can keep that money there because you're not taking any more from the federal government. So again, that blueprint is a very easy stepwise program that helps guide people through what needs to be done to help build the political will and belief that this can be done and that it will work for your state, and then that you can execute it to the benefit of your students.
Great. That's such a great overview of that, Melanie. And you're right. It's pretty simple to understand, as I mentioned before, with the other blueprint. And then the point you're making about retaining funds within the state to do the programs, I think that's such an important thing for people to understand. And it kind of brings to mind, too, when we updated the blueprint to close US Ed, we added something about should the federal government or should the Trump administration decide to send the money back to states through block grants, which we've heard a lot of talk about. There's actually a bill in Congress last year that would do that. So we updated our blueprint to say, should they do that? And then if you'll take it from there.
Yes. So Congressman Moore from Alabama had, if anybody's interested, HR 938 from last session to close the federal Department of Education. And he had a model where the block grant would be calculated based on the income tax of the citizens within that state. And when I saw that, I thought, perfect. So what we have proposed, they are working on a new bill for this session, and talked to his education policy staffer who's working on the actual bill, and proposed the idea that states actually could keep 80% of that money, put in the legislation that instead of getting a block grant of 100%, they can keep all of it for 80% if they institute their own process for keeping the money. So, and it would be based on the income tax that it's the model that they came up with, which was, I just thought, it was incredible. I never imagined they'd use that process to calculate the dollar value of the block grant. So they're intrigued by this idea. I don't know if they'll pick it up. We're hopeful, and we've been maintaining contact to make sure we're explaining it clearly and what the benefits are. But with the Doge mentality, if you could take 20% off the block grants in terms of federal savings, in addition to the actual education department itself, now the federal government is benefiting and the states are benefiting.
It is encouraging that there are so many, even experts and very knowledgeable researchers and book authors and think tanks are coming around and discussing the possibility that the government school system has failed our children. The president said it in his executive order. So that, you and I both know, has really encouraged the warriors like you and I that have been in this fight for decades. And so, of course, when we first started, we were the tinfoil hat ladies. And so today we're a little more mainstream, and that's comfortable. So thanks again, Melanie, for being on the podcast. This has been great. And thank you to our viewers and listeners for tuning in and supporting our work. Join me again next week for another episode of Unmasking Government Schools with Sherry Few.
U.S. Parents Involved in Education is a nonprofit coalition dedicated to restoring local control of education and parental authority. By empowering parents to reclaim responsibility for their children's learning and encouraging states to move away from federal influence, USPIE seeks to create a culture where parents are the primary decision-makers in education and schools support families without the burden of federal mandates. If you want to start a state or regional USPIE chapter in your area, please visit uspie.org and complete the brief questionnaire in the chapter section.